When Hu Jintao of China, Dmitry Medvedev of Russia, Manmohan Singh of India, Dilma Rousseff of Brazil, and Jacob Zuma of South Africa all get together in one room, in this case over 2 days in New Delhi, obviously something's up. After all, they represent a collective GDP which has quadrupled in the last decade to around $11 trillion now. But seriously, do the BRICS countries really stand for anything? Is it really an organisation? Welcome to Agenda. I'm Colin Chapman, and joining me to discuss this is Stratfor's Rodger Baker. Rodger, can you give us a little potted history?
Well, the grouping Brazil, Russia, India, China, now South Africa has created this series of summits. It's creating this sense of an organization or a club or a group. But in many ways, it's somewhat of an emerged entity that doesn't necessarily play off of any strong connection between these countries, other than that they're all emerging economies or were back in 2001. If we go back to the origin of this concept of BRIC, it comes out of a Goldman Sachs report that discusses emerging economies, the idea that over a decade emerging economies would take a stronger role in the global economy, and questioning whether something like the G7 should be altered to take into account the stronger role of China in particular, and possibly Brazil or Russia, and maybe behind that India. We see later in around 2006 that then Russian Premier Vladimir Putin decides to try to draw these countries together. And on the sidelines of the UNGA, he calls together the foreign ministers of the BRIC countries to start a dialogue. And the Russians are looking to use this as a way to take a leading role in global economics or in a smaller group of economics as a counter in some ways to the United States. The Russians had also been working with the Europeans as this way to balance out U.S. economic power.
Yes, I remember going to G8 meetings and other global summits when European and US political leaders were a bit sniffy about it. But it really caught the imagination of investment bankers who saw the opportunities to develop BRICS portfolios in their growing appetite for the emerging markets.
Yeah, in many ways there was no BRIC identity amongst the countries that were included in this acronym. In fact, instead of a BRIC identity, there was a bit of a South-South coordination going on that included Brazil, India, and South Africa at the time, but did not include the Chinese, and it didn't include the Russians. At the height of the global economic crisis, you see the Chinese and the Russians really step in and try to take this BRIC concept that had emerged on the backs of investors and turn it into some sense of a bloc. The Europeans were down, the Americans were down economically, but China was seen as the potential savior of the global economy. Russia was still strong due to natural resource development. These emerging countries didn't seem to have their GDP growth hit nearly as hard as the developed Western countries. And they exploited this for political reasons to try to say, okay, we're now the drivers of global economics. We should have the right to shape global financial and economic architecture.
Well, it's not an unreasonable view. And this is the fourth summit. And I guess these countries have all two things in common. They consider themselves underrepresented on the world stage. That probably doesn't apply to Russia. And they're all G20 members with high-risk economies of interest to global investors.
There is certainly that issue of global investment interest and from their perspective, this sense that they aren't represented at the level of their economy. And all of these, the four main countries are all within the top 12, 13 economies in the world. On the other hand, if you look at the differences between these countries, in many cases, they're in entirely different leagues. The Chinese economy so dwarfs any of the other members of BRICS, it's a wonder that they can work in a cooperative fashion rather than simply having to follow the Chinese lead. The political agenda of the countries is very different. Their reasons for joining is different. India is in BRICS in some ways to capitalize on everyone's attention on China. Everyone invests in China. They see China as this wonderfully huge and growing place. And India uses this to say, see, we're the same as China, so you should put your money in India. but they're not the same. Their economic structures are different. Their political relations are different. And in many ways, a lot of these countries are becoming even more competitive with each other. One of the things we see emerging, for example, for China, is that China is using this to try to reclaim what it considers its role as the voice of the developing markets, the emerging economies of the South. But we've seen a lot of pushback now because the Chinese economy is so big, because Chinese investment is so big, because Chinese resource exploitation is so big, that these southern countries are starting to view China in many ways the same way they used to view Europe or the United States.
Yes, and of course they would stress their similarities, but is there any scope at all for resolving their differences within these BRICS summits?
I think they do the best that they can to hide the differences. I think they try to brush them aside and they try to bring out some sort of common point to put into their final agenda. They don't want to be seen as bickering. They don't want to be seen as different from one another. They want to highlight this. That also in some ways weakens what this summit can actually accomplish, because your goal is simply to put forward a good positive face rather than necessarily to address any of the real deeper issues between these countries, or in many ways in the global economic structure. Instead, just to highlight again and again, well, we're all developing countries and it's our turn to run the world.
What about the strong rivalry between India and China over issues like Tibet? I noticed that now trade between the two is up 50% in a year to $63 billion. With such strong trade links, will we see the conflicts abating?
I think the relationship between China and India is very complex. Yes, trade is growing, and that's in part because China is a big and growing economy still. Even if they're facing some troubles now, India is still a growing economy. They're both massive populations. But I think that some of the competition is in fact going to increase between them, and some of the tensions are going to increase between them. Maybe not necessarily on the land borders, though we've seen some rise in those tensions lately, but certainly in the maritime sphere. China's economy has pushed it into the water. The Chinese are looking at the Indian Ocean basin as a vital link to their economic stability, their economic strength. That puts them right into the Indian backyard. The Indians have always felt a little nervous about their ability to patrol, to protect, to exert influence over what they consider to be their sphere of influence in that Indian Ocean basin. And I think on that sense, we're going to see maybe even greater tension between India and China there, even if they find economic ways to cooperate.
South Africa is a late entrant to BRICS. You can see why it wants to be in it and why the 4 original countries welcome it. But there are many others you'd expect to be in but are not, like Indonesia, for instance, the world's 4th largest country by population.
I think when we look at South Africa's inclusion, it was about bringing in Africa. It was about identifying that South Africa is a representation of that part of the, quote, South, and they wanted to make sure that they had that in there. I think the Chinese were pushing to bring South Africa in some ways to break down that IBSA cooperation and usurp it or take it over. Indonesia seems to be left on the sideline, and interestingly enough, in the original report on BRIC by Goldman Sachs, Indonesia is kind of a 5th country that's mentioned on the side as, well, we probably ought to keep an eye on this one as well.
Rodger Baker, thank you. And thanks to all of you for watching Stratfor's Agenda this week. I'm Colin Chapman, and until the next time, goodbye.